Good evening. Thank you all for being here today. It's really a pleasure to see all this interest in this event. My name is Ala Tartir, and I'm a researcher at the Small Arms Survey, coordinator of the Small Arms Survey Project and Security Assessment in North Africa, SANA project, which been going on since 2012, and currently we are in the third phase of this project. Outside you can see a number of our publications, and at the moment this project is funded by the Netherlands. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be moderating this panel on Libya, the current challenges and the future possibilities. And it's really a pleasure to be moderating this panel with internationally recognized experts on Libya that we're very lucky to have them with us here. So thanks for accepting the invitation and for speaking at this event here at the Graduate Institute. The panel will be relatively short, 1 hour, 15 minutes. So we're hoping for short and sweet panel, although the topic is not particularly easy to tackle and definitely not sweet. So we'll have 15 minutes intervention from each speaker, and then we'll have around 25 minutes for Q&A. I might introduce, or I should have introduced the experts and in the order of the delivering the presentation. To my left, we have Wolfram Lacher, who's a senior associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWB in Berlin. And Wolfram will be telling us more about the ongoing war, who's fighting who, what are the power dynamics in place, and what can we expect as future possibilities. And then we'll move to Rebecca Murray, who's a field researcher and freelance journalist. And Rebecca will reflect on her field expertise and telling us the story from the human perspective. What is the consequences of this ongoing war on people? And finally, we'll have Jalal Hershawi, a research fellow at the Conflict Research Unit of the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, coming from The Hague. And Jalal will tell us more about the Berlin process, as well as the international diplomacy and the role of external actors in this conflict, and also the possibilities that we have for the future. Lastly, please join our mailing list of the Small Arms Survey. Follow us on social media as well to see the publications that we keep producing, but also to participate in other events that we're organizing. And feel free to take publications that are outside related to this project. I don't want to take more time, and with no further ado, over to you.
Thanks, Ala, and good evening, everyone. I'll provide a brief overview of where we are in the current war in Tripoli and how we got there. The current civil war, which is Libya's third since 2011, started when Khalifa Haftar, on the 4th of April, launched an offensive to take control of Tripoli and seize power by force, initially using mainly forces from eastern and southern Libya. Haftar had, over the last few years, gradually established his control over eastern Libya and had recently expanded in southern Libya before launching this offensive. When he started this offensive, he apparently believed that he would quickly gain a foothold in Tripoli by getting some of the local militias to switch sides, but that didn't happen. Instead, most armed groups from western Libya united against Haftar, and Haftar's forces essentially haven't advanced since the first 3 or 4 days of the offensive. They have essentially been stuck in their positions, and they've lost one of their 2 main bases for the offensive, the city of Radian, about 100 kilometers south of Tripoli, in late June. But other than that, the front lines have been pretty much steady. This is a map from August, and with some minor changes it still is the situation today. There have been modest advances by Haftar's forces these last 3 weeks. The war focuses on Greater Tripoli because it's in Tripoli that everything's at stake. The power is at stake. And neither of the two sides want to expose themselves at least until now, they haven't wanted to expose themselves by opening up second fronts. The casualties the war has caused until now, in terms of civilian casualties, have been relatively low in international standards. More than 200 civilians have been killed since April. At least 2,000 combatants have been killed, although the number could be significantly higher because there are no reliable figures for Haftar's side. And hundreds of thousands of people have fled the areas of conflict south of Tripoli. Now, the fact that this conflict erupted in the first place and that it has lasted until today has to do not only with Haftar's miscalculation that he could take Tripoli quickly, but also with errors of judgment in Western capitals that went into the same direction. We saw this very early on in the conflict. The Western reactions to Haftar's offensive were extremely muted, to put it mildly. And Western states didn't do anything against the foreign support pouring into Libya in support of Haftar's offensive, particularly in the form of combat drones from the Emirates and other forms of support from the Emirates and Egypt, which then prompted Haftar's opponents to mobilize support themselves from Turkey, also in the form of combat drones, among other things, and thereby the conflict evolved into a regional proxy war, which in recent months, since September, has gained an additional dimension with the arrival of substantial contingents of Russian mercenaries, which are also what accounts for the modest advances of Haftar's forces in the last 3 weeks. This very, very briefly is the international context in which the war is taking place. Now, who are the parties to the conflict? Haftar and his supporters will tell you this is the army fighting against criminal militias and extremists in Tripoli. Some will tell you this is East against West in Libya. Haftar's opponents will tell you this is Democrats fighting against the attempt to establish a military dictatorship. And yet others will tell you that this is only about control of the oil wealth. All of these narratives are wrong. Some more, some less. The forces fighting against Haftar are a coalition of local armed groups from Western Libya primarily, although they also include some people who fled Eastern and Central Libya. They are not extremists to the extent that they include extremists. We're talking about individuals rather than groups. And the militias that in recent years carved up Tripoli among themselves and pillaged state institutions form a very small part of this alliance. The bulk of this alliance is made up of volunteers who were leading civilian lives before Haftar's offensive and who mobilized as volunteers. These forces are essentially the same forces that fought against Gaddafi in 2011, particularly when we're talking about Western Libya. They have the same social base, they come from the same cities, they have many of the same leaders, and for most of them, the fight today is the same, pretty much the same as 2011. It is to prevent the establishment of a dictatorship that they brought down in 2011. Now, at the same time, it's a fractious alliance. There have been conflicts among some of these forces over the last few years, and they are essentially unified by the common threat that Haftar poses to them. There are serious tensions among them. Haftar's forces are a combination of units he built up over the last few years in eastern Libya. Haftar started out in 2014 in eastern Libya with a coalition of local armed groups that was quite loose, over which he had very little control, but he gradually managed to centralize authority over this alliance and establish units that were directly loyal to him, using the foreign support that he monopolized, support from the UAE, from Egypt, and from France. So a combination of those units from eastern Libya and local armed groups from western Libya that in many cases have their own power base, their own resources, their own leaders, and that in many cases are much more independent of Haftar. And in this alliance, there are two significant subgroups. First, hardline Salafis, who are followers of one particular Saudi preacher, Rabi al-Madkhali, and second, supporters of, or former supporters of the Gaddafi regime, meaning former members of Gaddafi's security apparatus or members of local constituencies of cities that were considered in 2011 and after 2011 to be pro-regime. And within this ex-regime component of Haftar's alliance, or at least within a big part of this component, there appears to be a judgment or an expectation that they can use Haftar to get into Tripoli, and once there, they can come forced upon themselves. So where is the conflict heading? This will very soon be the longest of Libya's 3 civil wars, in a week or two. And it's lasted now more than 7 months, and there are clear signs of war fatigue on both sides. On Haftar's side, we see this because the proportion of mercenaries among Haftar's forces is growing. Haftar appears to have difficulties mobilizing greater numbers of Libyan fighters. On the side of his opponents, we see it in declining mobilization for the war effort. So when I was on my last trip in October, late October, it was clear that there were significantly fewer people at the front line than on my previous visit in June. And also in October, the complaints, the frustrations among the anti-Haftar forces about the government at Tripoli, about the government not being able to mobilize sufficient support from abroad, not really being serious about winning, being busy mainly with self-enrichment, being infiltrated by people who are complicit with Haftar. All these accusations have become much stronger than they had previously been. So there is a clear sense of war fatigue by now. Well, sounds like the conditions are ripening for negotiations, right? Unfortunately, not at all. Negotiations are nowhere near not in sight at all, because first of all, Haftar is waging a war of attrition. He has much more generous foreign support, and he judges that with the help of Emirati airstrikes and with the help of Russian mercenaries, eventually he will be able to wear down the opposing alliance until at some point it crumbles. His opponents simply cannot negotiate, cannot enter into a ceasefire, even if Haftar wanted, with the current balance of forces being what it is, with Haftar's forces sitting on the outskirts of Tripoli, threatening to come in at any moment, because that would mean that this alliance would split. It would split into opponents and proponents of a ceasefire, opponents and proponents of negotiations with Haftar. And what is now latent distrust between various components in this alliance would turn into open enmity, and it would be very difficult for them to come back together again. So that would allow Haftar to move forward militarily. So talks with Haftar would be absolutely fatal for this alliance, and they are very well aware of that. So all the talk that we've been hearing from foreign governments since April about there only being a political solution is all nonsense. There is no political solution in this situation. There hasn't been since April. There are two scenarios that I could see that could create the conditions in which negotiations could take place. One would be a much more robust approach by Western states that would ensure that anyone who would violate the ceasefire would be punished, and we're not seeing this at all. We're not seeing the readiness to take these kinds of steps. And the other scenario would be that both alliances fragment, not only Haftar's opponents, but Haftar's alliance as well. But that would require that Haftar suffers military reversals, and that therefore his allies from Western Libya come under pressure to negotiate, and that is not what is happening at the moment. So in the absence of developments that could create the conditions for negotiations, I think that this conflict is likely to get much more violent than it has been to date, particularly given what we've seen in terms of recent changes in the battlefield since the arrival of Russian mercenaries in the last few weeks.
We'll get some more questions after all the presentation, but more of these notes is available on our survey publication, Who's Fighting Who in Tripoli, that you can find on the website, but also outside, as well as in Wolfram's forthcoming book that's coming out in March, Libya's Fragmentation. But now we move to Rebecca to take us to other dimensions of this conflict and how it affects people's life, and take us to Libya.
Thank you, Ella. Thanks to everyone here at the Graduate School and to the Small Arms Survey. My name is Rebecca, and I'm a freelance journalist. I've been going in and out of Libya since 2012, so just after the 2011 revolution. I just want to give you a few snapshots from the ground, since I have visited Libya a couple times during this current war, just to give you a sense of what life is like on the ground. So Wolfram had given you the overview of the armed groups and where they were, and this map is excellent. I visited the front line first time just after the war had started. That was started on April 4th. I went at the end of April. And it was quite busy at the front, as Wolfram had said. Lots of different, it was a coalition of different armed groups. Some of them were very disciplined, other ones were slightly unruly. Other ones who I once went with drove me in a Porsche and wore Versace t-shirts and flip-flops. The other ones who I visited long-term were much more disciplined, had uniforms, had been fighting many battles, including ISIS in Sirte previously, and before that in Misrata against the Gaddafi regime in 2011. It was these fighters that I have spent most time with when I return. I've really noticed, as Wolfram has said, a change in atmosphere from those early days where there were those day trippers showing off their clothes and cars, to now where it's extremely serious, extremely violent, and people are very worried. The fighters who I've been visiting are in Yarmouk camp, which is, I think, Wolfram, on your map.
Do we have a pointer? No. Hang on.
Yarmouk is one place which has been going back and forth in the battle. It's an extremely intense area to be in.
Yarmouk is around here. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Salafatini Road.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the second time I visited them, which this was in August, the mood had changed, as I mentioned. And one of the reasons for the change was just the amount of drone strikes that were happening. Now, we've heard Rassan Salameh say to the Security Council that there are estimated over 800 drone strikes by Haftar's side, and about 230 on the GNA side. So this is really a war being conducted in the air as well as on the ground. So the group I visited in Yarmouk were extremely concerned. Every night they would have to turn all the lights off, hide in their cars, not light up the cigarettes, anything like this to send a signal that they were there. Many of them have been hit. And that doesn't just go for fighters, that also goes for the field hospitals and the medics that staff them. Often the medics would have to go and retrieve wounded people, and there have been many cases where they have been targeted and cases where doctors have been killed. When I visited the medics who were nearby, Salahuddin and Yarmouk camp, they were saying to me that they did not want to give their coordinates to the ICRC or governing bodies because they were scared that those coordinates would be used against them and that they would be struck. So they were basically in hiding, and they would go from warehouse to warehouse. We're talking about the outskirts of Tripoli. So there were warehouses to hide in and bring the beds, etc. Also on the ground, there were 128, as I last counted, 128,000 IDPs, so displaced people from their houses, as well as more of them who wanted to stay because they didn't want their homes to be looted or occupied by either friend or enemy. The ones who were displaced were often in schools and still are today, so that's 8 months later. They're in places where privacy is scarce, where electricity, where water, all of these things are very, very scarce. And also school has started, and yet they are in the schools, so where do the kids go? The trouble also with these families was that first you get the adrenaline of having to flee your home, but hoping you'll go back. When you go back and either find out that your home may be looted or occupied, or if you can't go back but just continue worrying about it in your mind, it can lead to sudden panic. But when it goes long term, you start settling into a kind of, many people were suffering from PTSD. And sitting around doing nothing, just worrying and hearing very close by the sounds of the airstrikes around them was not good at all, especially for the kids. What you get then is a lot of cases of domestic violence, fighting, cases of abuse, including sexual abuse, all together making it a really unlivable atmosphere, as well as the municipalities getting tired of having to host all these people and bringing food, etc. to them. They are staying in the midst of what can only be described as just enormous piles of garbage. And Salahuddin Road was just cleared up, but the garbage collection has really been naught because of the fighting all around. The fighters and youths who I met had also described how they had been going through wars since they were about 11, 12 years old. So take a kid from Misrata, for instance. 8 years ago was the revolution. He was probably with his family going through the siege from Gaddafi's troops. Cut to the war with against ISIS militants in Sirte, which was extremely violent and bloody. And they lived through that, where there was a lot of people who died from Misrata, leaving a lot of widows or missing children, lots of people who had to have limbs amputated, etc. And then you come to this war. A lot of the people who were participating in the fighting had what psychiatrists I talked to on the ground, they had a form of PTSD, a lot of them. They were doing a lot of drugs, not all, but a lot of them, which is drugs meaning it's usually tramadol ground up with ecstasy, ground up with other things, or hashish. And you're either drinking homemade alcohol and then going to the front line. When they are not on the front line, you can find a lot of people gathered around electricity posts because they're playing Bojbi, which is a video game, slightly like Fortnite. I don't know if you guys are acquainted with Fortnite, but it's one that you all as a group go and hunt down the enemy. So when you're not doing it in reality, you're kind of taking your mind off things by playing on the internet. The psychologists too that I talked to said that they were dealing with a lot of people who had suffered previously kidnapping, a lot of violence again, and a lot of cases of people who had just come out of prisons, and a lot of rape of men. So very sensitive topics and a very big need for psychiatric services. The other more brighter news was that you could really sense some survivors. So at the local university, which had housing that was occupied by people who had been made homeless from the fighting, there were students who were really trying to complete their studies. They unfortunately didn't have a place to stay because other families were taking the rooms. So they would book themselves in hotels and try and study through these airstrikes, which is pretty amazing to have that commitment. And I think it was about 30% who passed at the end of this school term after many interruptions. Finally, everyone talked to me pretty much at the end of a conversation about boats. And I have never heard this before from Libyans specifically. Usually it's when I cover stories from people who are migrating through the country, who have come maybe from sub-Saharan Africa or from the other parts of the Middle East. So this was shocking. And they were talking very seriously about it, about how families would get together, pool some money, and invest in a wooden boat that could last them to Lampedusa, to Malta, without getting apprehended at sea. So this was one refrain that kept on going. The other way people would cope, and I'll end with this because it's slightly more hopeful, but there were two motorcycle groups in Tripoli that I had met over the years. One was called Sons of the Sahara, and the other one was called the VIP Bikers, who had a branch in Tunis too. And these guys just wanted to escape from the war. This was not their war. They did not want Haftar. That was what they told me. They did not want a dictator again. And they said, let's get rid of him, and then we'll get rid of the militias, because they knew there was a militia problem in Tripoli. So what they had, the number one rule when you join the club is no politics. And they used to ride, way back in the day, from one side of Libya to the other, when you could, right? This was just after the revolution. Now they are pretty much restricted to a couple neighborhoods along the seafront, maybe from Souka Juma to downtown Tripoli, which is where they hang out in the two cafes where their friends give them cappuccinos, etc. And they try and laugh and plan for the next big biking trip ahead. So these guys, I think, have a real survivor spirit in what is, as Wolfram says, a very increasingly depressive outlook in Libya itself.
more of these reporting appeared on Middle East Eye recently, but also please keep an eye on the Sana publications again, and I'm taking this opportunity to make publicity for more publications coming out on strategic skies, the role of airports in the Libyan conflict. This will come out in 2020, and Rebecca is one of the authors, as well as Fiona Manton with her. Maybe now we move to Jalal for your intervention, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Small Arms Survey, for the invitation. Thank you very much, everyone. So it's kind of shocking to hear about the situation, and I think we all have this reflexive reaction. We wonder what the international community is doing as this conflict keeps getting uglier and uglier and more appalling. What the World Front said during his conclusion is that he basically thinks that it's necessary to have a robust attitude on the part of Western states. And I would like, as part of my presentation, to give the story of why the attitude of Western states hasn't been robust. Instead, it has been soft, exceedingly soft. I would like to start my story in late August, early September. There was a moment of hope for Western diplomacy, international diplomacy in general. Late August, there was for the first time in a while a new U.S. ambassador, a full-blown American ambassador installed for Libya. So there was this promise that finally the United States was going to sit down and look at the Libya situation. And very soon afterward, the special envoy for the United Nations, Hassan Salame, noticed that the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, personally was apparently committed to being involved in Libya and try to make a contribution that would make a difference before the end of her career. So that personal commitment was promising, and it seemed that there was good thinking and a healthy thrust, because the original idea of the Germans was that they were not France. So that's a good start, because France has been anything but neutral in Libya. It has been quite one-sided. It has supported one particular faction for the last half decade. And the idea would be to have this real European giant, maybe not a member of the permanent member of the UNSC, but at least someone that would be willing to offset the one-sided attitude of France. The other idea was that Germany has a close relationship with Turkey, so it would have the ability to bring in one violator of the arms embargo. So that was basically the starting point. And the idea was to say that there was a problem with the Libyan crisis that was not Libyan, it was foreign. This structural inability of the international community to stop violating the arms embargo. So the idea was to focus on slowing that part down. And then you would have maybe another component of the same initiative that would concentrate on Libyans, and at the time they were talking about reviving the Hadames conference, maybe even in Libya. So you had this idea of separating the two dimensions and to focus on the fact that the foreign states themselves were not completely white as snow. So you could see, of course, that there was now a need to bring in another state, a big violator, much bigger, much more consequential, in the sense that the UAE, I'm talking about the UAE, has been conducting a full-blown military intervention. It doesn't just use armed drones, but it also sends fighter jets with pilots that bomb Libya, and amazingly, no one actually acknowledges this in official circles. So the idea would be to say, okay, why don't we bring the UAE on one side and Turkey on the other, treat them as equals, try to kind of forget about the past, start from scratch, build confidence, and try to change basically the catch-22 that we are in. And the UAE to bring it into the process, you had Germany was not particularly well positioned, and you could see the flaw that you had from the start, that you had from the beginning. Germany was effectively reliant on the Trump administration. So you basically started with this idea that maybe the United States, the Trump administration, would help Angela Merkel. So that's, you could see that there's a problem from the start. So here you have one trick, is that the UAE, of course, has refused to be at the same table as Turkey. And you have a trick that was kind of played. Egypt was willing to play that role. The UAE is involved, but in the various meetings that have occurred since September, there has been no mention clearly and officially that the UAE was violating the arms embargo. The other problem, of course, is that France has a good diplomacy, has used its diplomatic muscles to make sure that the UAE was not going to be bothered or criticized. So very quickly you end up with an initiative that had all the good intentions, the right direction, decent thinking, that has become muffled. So I don't want to give the impression that that Berlin is a complete waste of time. I think it could still turn out to be fruitful, because now if you notice, there's no emphasis on the international conference that Berlin was supposed to be. At the beginning, there was this idea that something very, very clear was going to happen in early November, and it would deliver something drastic, like maybe announce a ceasefire, and that idea has faded away. Now, diplomats talk about a process or a framework. It's a series of working sessions with no particular deadline. So you could see that it has slowed down. And to slow down is not necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes you could do things better. But inherently, by slowing down diplomatic action of the Western states or the international community in general within the context of a war of attrition, you're effectively helping one side only of the conflict. It's the side that is intent on using time and who believes that time is on their side, and that's the Haftar side. So among the slow initiatives that were started, as part of this process, they talk about 6 themes, or 6 baskets of themes. You have economic reforms, and here again, the United States has taken an interest in the economic reforms. It takes it very seriously, and you have this idea of bringing the 2 central banks together, making sure that whatever exists in the form of a wild banking system in the East would be regularized and absorbed into the Tripoli one, which is the institutional past of the true financial system of Libya. Here again, it looks like something completely driven by good intentions, and the people pushing it are well-intentioned indeed, but structurally you end up helping only one side. It's the side that has accumulated more than 32 or 35 billion dinars of wild debt, that has brought in very unlawful ways banknotes printed in Russia, when Russia is not the official printer for that particular country, and it's of course the eastern side. The eastern side, if the economic reforms take place the way they have been discussed by mainly the Americans, are going to provide relief more than anything to the east. And again, there's still no rush, and the war of attrition can continue playing out. So how, and I would like to kind of ask those questions now, is how come this war's international dimension seem to be unstoppable, right? That's what the last 3 months seem to indicate, is that it's unfeasible. I'd like to, even what has happened with Washington is also quite discouraging. On the 14th of November, because of the Russian involvement, the Russian mercenaries that Wolfram mentioned, you ended up having a reaction triggered for the first time in DC, where you had the US Department of State issuing a declaration that names the Libyan National Army of Khalifa Haftar explicitly and calling on it to stop the offensive on Tripoli and mentioning the Russian intervention explicitly. Just 2-3 days, of course here it was the Department of State, and no political appointee was involved in this process. It was only career diplomats, career militaries that, of course, in the Pentagon, Russia is not liked. But when it came to the political layer, nobody was really pushing, nobody was really providing their support. And sure enough, a few days later, you had an anonymous source in the White House of Donald Trump that made a few comments according to which the United States does appreciate the action, the counterterrorism efforts of Khalifa Haftar. So you see here that this inability to conduct one coherent policy that actually makes a difference. Very, very soon it splits in two and then ends up having very little effect. So this is the problem in general. There's no, from a political perspective, the White House doesn't really have a problem with Russia in this particular case. The Élysée Palace in Paris doesn't have a big problem with Russia from a political or ideological perspective. So you cannot really expect a robust action against this particular aspect. The UAE, how come the UAE seems so untouchable? Well, the UAE is perceived as the closest thing to the ideal Arab ally by 3 permanent members of the Security Council. The United States is not interested in exerting any kind of pressure on the UAE. And God forbid you ask this kind of favor from France. France is never going to go against the UAE. And Russia is not going to do that, of course, either. The UAE is perceived as dynamic, filled with initiative, disciplined, truly militarized. When it buys a weapon, it knows how to use it, it's willing to spend money, it's willing to violate international law and do all the dirty work as long as you protect it diplomatically and so on and so forth. So that's sort of ally nobody wants to burn bridges with or anger in any way. How come France is interested in this kind of policy? Well, France believes, by and large, in the narrative of Haftar. It thinks that Haftar has a secular army, that it's not corrupt, that it's going to win, that effectively because France has been helping it for, as I said, 5 years now, what is going to happen is the emergence of a pro-France Libya. That would be a regime that would appear now in Tripoli within the foreseeable future, and that is perceived by the French policymakers as a very promising source of prestige in the Arab world, and by the same token, you end up winning a Libya that looks after a lot of your African problems, because France has a sphere of influence that is considered a vital strategic interest. I'm thinking about Chad particularly, and having this last piece of the puzzle in the form of a pro-Paris Tripoli, then it basically becomes like almost paradise on earth. So you could go on like this, but I would like to finish just with the motivation of the UAE. It's not really discussed in detail in the literature. Just a few remarks. The UAE was deeply shocked by the American decision in 2003 to go and topple a Sunni regime in Iraq. So you have a big disappointment there on the part of a state that was already quite remarkable in the Arab world in terms of its willingness to build a true military, to have a willingness to intervene outside. It had participated in the Balkans in the 90s and so on and so forth. And then you have another trauma from the point of view of the UAE. You have what they perceive as an appalling lack of leadership on the part of the Americans in January, February 2011. That's the fact that Barack Obama betrayed Mubarak. So the idea of the UAE is that the US is obviously not reliable in terms of leadership. The Americans are leaving the region over the long run, over the next 15 years, let's say. They're still around. They have to be managed. You have to treat them as a very important actor, obviously. but they have to show the leadership. They feel responsible for the Arab Sunni universe. They know Saudi Arabia is not going to do it, nobody else is going to do it. They think they're going to basically be the umbrella that oversees the geopolitical system that would be constituted by this series of Arab Sunni states. In this context, you can't afford to lose a country that has a small Sunni population with no sectarian divide, very wealthy, very well located. In this kind of context, I'm talking about Libya, any kind of ideology would succeed, and you don't want the Muslim Brotherhood, and to be sure that you don't want anything that resembles political Islam. The best way to do it is to make sure that no pluralism exists in Libya. So what I'm highlighting here, I'm going to finish with this, is that the fears or the motivations of the UAE, of course you have the economic aspect, I don't want to discount it, but the main driver is ideological. You see here that the fears don't really have to do with physical security. They're far away anyway, but they don't really think in terms of physical security. It has to do with ideological security. They see the success of, let's say, the Muslim Brotherhood in Tripoli, collecting oil wealth and being a model for the region, as an ideational threat. They think in terms of soft threats. And that's why they're not really sensitive to whatever happens in terms of the security deterioration that we've had the last year or so. They don't think in terms of physical security. They think in terms of who might survive we stop the policy now. That is unacceptable. As a result, you continue with the war until your ideological enemies disappear.
Thank you very much, Jalal, and well, thank you all for sticking to the time, which allows us 25 minutes for questions and answers. But Jalal also wrote a piece for Sana, which is also available outside, on how Algeria faces the Libyan conflict, which is highly recommended as well. And on that note, let's open the floor for some questions and answers. So please introduce yourself briefly and to whom you address the question. And please start.
Hi, I'm Faris Mahouchi. I'm from Tunisia, and I'm a first-year international affairs master's candidate here at the Graduate Institute. And my question is about Algeria and Tunisia and how the Western kind of neighbors of Libya are reacting to the latest development. And well, I don't know if Algeria can do much because it's focused on its own problems. But for Tunisia, Tripoli is a very important center, and Libya generally is a very important center, especially that Tunisia now in next January is joining the Security Council. How its foreign policy might try to sway things in a certain direction, maybe.
One thing that I think is interesting is the fact that when Algeria was active, basically Algeria had ceased to be really active on Libya maybe a year or two before the departure of Bouteflika in April. So that had to do with the fact that the most knowledgeable decision makers had been pushed out for political reasons in 2015. But when they were active, they had an impact. I think Algeria played a role in the installation of the GNA, the Government of National Accord, in 2015. They helped in many ways. It was part of the most active states. When they thought about Libya, they were actually, the number one priority was to avoid exactly what has happened this year. So that's one. Very ironic. The other irony is that most of how they looked at it was through Tunisia. They were more worried about a Tripoli war perturbing Tunisia and making it more fragile and causing a problem in Tunisia than in the south of Algeria. So that is also quite not noteworthy, and it's interesting to notice this. During all those years, Tunisia was never really active because it just cannot really have a big impact. Maybe with the seat, the UNSC could do something, but I don't think it's looking to provoke any of the Gulf states, for instance. Right now, Algeria is completely, as you said yourself, consumed, absorbed by its own domestic uncertainty, so it doesn't really have a foreign policy. the institutional memory is still there. If you speak with people, they will tell you that they hate what is happening in 2019, but there's no action, there's no any plan, there's no coherence. The last thing also is that Germany has made a point of excluding both Tunisia and Algeria from the Berlin process. So then one idea is to avoid dilution, which is, I think, is a laudable initiative on the part of the Germans. There are other reasons that are less global, but it's interesting to see that Italy has been quite insistent that Tunisia and Algeria and Chad should be involved. So, but in general, I think right now the two do not matter in the big scheme of things. They just don't matter.
Please.
Hello, my name is Oscar. I'm a Spanish student at the Institute, Masters in International Affairs. And my question was, what are the main consequences, according to you, of the 2011 NATO intervention, both for the Libyan state and the society?
Big question. I mean, in terms of the state, in 2011, what happened was that with the regime, central authority collapsed, right? So the state, in terms of the bureaucracy and the central bank and the National Oil Corporation and the whole bureaucracy, in fact, the whole machinery through which oil revenues are distributed, all that continued to work. But central authority, in terms of a government that is able to use security forces in order to establish its authority and in order to prevent, for example, parts of the oil infrastructure from being appropriated by local armed groups, that collapsed. So this was, of course, a fundamental change, right, in the nature of the state in Libya, and it led to the proliferation of armed groups that were, in almost all cases, actually financed by the state, right, through the state, because different political factions had their representatives in the governments and in the defense ministry, in the interior ministry, and everyone was building up forces that were, loyal or allied to them. So that's in terms of the state, but I think it's important to mention that after the intervention or after the collapse of the regime, you still had you did actually have a transitional process that that was working for quite some time. You had elections that went relatively well, and the governments were very weak because they didn't have this ability to enforce decisions. But still, there was a transitional process that could have succeeded under certain conditions, under certain, if certain events had been different, it wasn't inevitable that the transition would fail. One of the problems, of course, was that the war in 2011 was also a civil war between different components of Libyan society, right? And that the regime did have significant support, and that entire communities were stigmatized by the revolutionaries as regime loyalists and were excluded after the collapse of the regime. So that was also a key legacy of the war in 2011. Very briefly.
Rebecca Jalal, any other insights on this question?
No, I just wanted to add to the last sentence. I think you could arguably look at 2019 as an advantage from a lot of those groups that were marked as losers and just completely dismissed. So you could see that the time horizon was like 8 years. So you wonder, like, does Western policy think with an 8-year horizon at least? No, unfortunately. But you do have connections between this year and your question. That's
Please.
I want to thank you for the panel and Many thanks for the panelists. My name is Bilal Salame. I'm a PhD student here. I have a couple of questions. One about, to some extent, anti-Haftar coalition or alliance in Tripoli is able to resist this aggression, while meanwhile the support of Haftar is continuing. The other question, speaking of Madkhali's components on Haftar sides, what the status and behavior of Madkhali's group in Tripoli? Are they aligned with Haftar or against Haftar at the moment? And also about the Turkish intervention after April 2009, was it effective and affected the balance of power on the ground or not? Speaking of Italy and its involvement, how can you evaluate Italy against France in Libya in general?
So that's 4 in 1, I guess, right? So 4 questions. Pick and choose. Who would like to start with?
Yeah, I mean, on Italy, I think in general there's a tendency on the part of the media, especially, I mean, now with the new government in Italy that is less populist. You have a clear desire to not get into the old Salvini versus Macron fight. So there's a strong desire to avoid having an appearance of antagonism between France and Italy. So that's why you haven't seen it in the headlines. There's a willingness to avoid that. But during the Salvini years, I think there was an exaggeration on the part of the journalists to put Italy and France on the same level. I mean, Italy is much less powerful on the international scene. And in general, when you focus on the Italy versus France issue, then you end up forgetting about the role of Gulf states, for example. So I would tend to tone it down. I mean, this is not to say that Italy doesn't matter. It hasn't mattered on multiple key inflection points in 2015, 2017, and so on and so forth. And maybe it will make a comeback. But right now, it has been drowned out by other states.
So hang on, there were several questions there. There were the Madakhila, there was Italy, there was Turkey, there was the ability of the forces to. I think some of these questions are linked because right now we're really seeing an impact, a change in the battlefield that is happening because of the arrival of Russian mercenaries with new equipment and new tactics, and I think that it will be. I mean, the anti-Haftar alliance is not on the verge of collapsing, but if they are to hold their ground, currently they're being pushed back slightly. If they are to hold their ground, they will need to pull even in some way or another, as they pulled even earlier this year when they mobilized Turkish drones to make up for the Emirati drones, right? The Turkish drones were very effective for a while. For a while, they did a lot of damage to Haftar's forces and to the Emiratis. But for the last few months, Turkey doesn't seem to have kept up its level of support, and it's not entirely clear why. So depending on why the Turks haven't kept up their support, that also gives you the answer of whether the forces fighting against Haftar will be able to mobilize the support they need to withstand the current offensive that they're facing.
I have a question about that actually. Just because, as we know, Mitiga Airport, which is the international airport in Tripoli, the only one, is now being closed for the past 2.5 months due to airstrikes. And it is also known that Turkish drones were perhaps operating from Mitiga. I'm wondering, is that one of the reasons maybe why Turkey hasn't come in with more equipment? Because both Mitiga keeps on getting targeted, and as well as Misrata, which is now the only place for people in West Libya to get an international flight out, has been hit 15 times.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, the Turkish drones have been taken out. one after the other, and essentially, every time they were used, they risked being taken out. So clearly, there has been an Emirati air superiority for several months now, right? And this is obviously having an impact on the ground. The Madakhila, or there were of course a lot of suspicions in Western Libya towards groups that were considered to be followers of Rabi al-Madkhali, right? or that were considered to be under the influence of this Madkhali ideology, because these groups, the Madakhila, play such an important role in Haftar's alliance, including in Western Libya. Many of Haftar's most important allies in Western Libya are influenced by this kind of I think that the problem for groups in Tripoli, whether they are Madkhali or not Madkhali, in the end, they are local armed groups. They're militias controlling parts of the capital with significant interests in the territories and the ministries and the institutions that they control. And they know that if Haftar were to come in, even if they side with him initially, he can do anything once he's in control. So I think that this probably plays a more important role than ideological considerations.
No.
All good. All good.
Yeah.
We understood more questions. Yeah.
No questions.
Yeah, I just don't want you to leave the room not full. We have Andrea.
Yes, Andrea Cellino. I'm from DICA, organization next door that has a small Libya program and tries to navigate through all these difficulties and trying to do something useful. And my question would exactly go in that direction. You painted, all of you, a very gloomy picture of in which stalemate is the best possible outcome, and the worst is a protracted and more violent conflict with all the international actors sort of mutually excluding with these complicated convergence and divergence of interests, the fact that the international community is completely blocked. I noticed that none of you mentioned the UN or the EU, and it's quite significant because the EU is clearly blocked by the different interests of some of its members, and in particular the position of France, and the UN, the Security Council, basically the same. So what is to be done in the case of course, the scenario in which Haftar eventually prevails? How do you see European countries just sitting on their hands and not doing anything, or how do you foresee this development? Or if there's a protracted conflict, is there anything that the international community, let's use this definition, or all the plethora of organizations that are trying to work on Libya at different level, local, what could they do practically to alleviate or lessen the impact of this protracted violent conflict?
Another big question.
It's $1 million question.
The one thing that I would like to say with regard to this scenario is that from an ideological perspective, and also in terms of tolerating what is most likely an autocratic project that might, in your question, prevail.
Mhm.
We already know the answer because we already have Egypt. And if you look at the attitude of all members, I'm not just talking about France, all members of the EU, you have profound acceptance vis-a-vis everything that the Abdel Fattah Sisi regime does. You know, I'm not talking about just the war against Muslim brothers. You know, going after the weathermen, going after the economists, going after women's rights activists. The EU is completely fine with this, and this is already something we know because it's the present. Now, in terms of reacting to the violent conflict or reacting to a bout of destruction that really is avoidable, we also know the answer because there hasn't been any strong reaction this year. If you look at the situation now in Libya compared to a year ago, it's day and night. A lot of it is completely unnecessary in many regards. And from the European perspective, we should have had a much stronger reaction. And as Walter said, it has been muted. So this is not just a France problem, it's everybody. There's no alarm. Even on the part of Italy, I reject the notion that there's a profound panic in Rome. You know, of course they're bothered, they're worried, but it's important. They think they can manage it. The oil is coming, migration is zero. It's like roughly 300 people arriving in Sicily every month. It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jalal that if it becomes clear that Haftar can take control in Tripoli, then everyone will jump on the Haftar train in Europe. I mean, there's no question about that. But we're not at that point. And essentially, you've had most European states hedging their position since April, including the Italians. The Italians haven't had a clear position because they don't know which way things will go. I think there are developments that could. I mean, there are factors that could push developments in a different direction. For example, the U.S. reaction to the increased involvement of the Russians. I mean, we'll have to see whether the U.S. is ready to actually follow up its change in rhetoric over the last week or so with actual pressure on Haftar, on the Emirates, and on others in order to limit this increasing Russian influence. This could change things, and it could also potentially bring France into greater, or the French government into greater difficulty in explaining its policy in Libya. Right? I mean, until now, with the exception of this brief little scandal at the end of June when French missiles were discovered in Riyadh, there hasn't really been a debate, including in France itself, about why it is that the French are actually supporting this policy. So, yes, and then you have the other scenario that the conflict could drag on for a long time, and even if Haftar is making advances, it could drag on for a long time, and he might not live to see its end. Right? So a lot of factors. There are a lot of factors that could change the dynamics that we're seeing right now.
And even if Haftar prevails, he's not going to be as Sisi as many certainly of those who support him would imagine, and so that there will be continued unrest probably in Libya, even if Haftar prevails, correct? So that there will still be a room for some international role, I mean positive, in trying to stabilize or at least to improve the situation, or do you think it would just...
I think you're asking a question about room the opportunity to make a difference. And there's no question that there's room, there's a lot of opportunity. What I would like to insist upon is the lack of will, lack of desire, political desire.
And Rebecca, if we bring the Libyan people to this question or to the equation, so after all these years of intervention, especially of the UN, and thanks for bringing this up, Andrea, how do they perceive it now? Obviously, they tried, they failed, they tried, and they keep trying. But based on your conversations, how do they perceive, like the UN in particular, but like this kind of external intervention to build a different future for the Libyans? Are they totally fed up, or they still believe that externally sponsored or intervention is a way or an avenue to build a different future? I know these are two different questions, but like I want to bring the Libyan people to the equation.
Sure, exactly.
You as a representative of the Libyan people.
From
the start.
No, as having talked to many Libyans.
I was very clear with that.
What I've noticed is that since the UN-backed government, the GNA, came in March 2016, I believe, they arrived at Abu Sitta naval base from your country of Tunis, and set up the government from there. First very small and then restricted to Tripoli. And people at first, I think, were cautious but hopeful that maybe there would be a change. Now when I chat to people do not, it's just worlds away between the government and Sarraj and the people and Ghassan Salami. They feel that there is no touching of the realities, that they're seeing garbage on the streets. They are having a huge liquidity crisis for a few years. They've seen militias that have been empowered by the GNA government coming in and paying off for protection. So they really don't put that much hope in to the UN at the moment. They just feel like it's too far. Having said that, though, there is no other option. So this is it. It's kind of, you're stuck with it. A lot of people who are pro-Haftar in Tripoli right now at the moment are keeping quiet. So it's hard to find them out. You don't hear much of a voice. But the people who say they are against Haftar, and including the fighters on the front line, they basically don't look at the UN to save them now, because we've had so many statements passed condemning the fighting, but without mentioning the perpetrator's name of these airstrikes, for instance. So they've given up on that. And they just basically, again, keep saying, we don't want another dictator and we don't want militias. So we'll get rid of the dictator first and then we'll deal with the militias. That's what.
Thank you. Amelia?
Hi, I'm Amelia. I work at the Salon Survey. You were talking about the Security Council and the UN, and I'm interested in the role of China. I read something recently that, in terms of Chinese...
Well, it could have a role. It could turn out to have like it. Yes, there was some comments by Angela Merkel about Hong Kong that were really not appreciated at all by Beijing. And the hope, from a Libya perspective, the hope of the Germans is to achieve a UNSC resolution. And of course, China is part of the 5 members. So there's a rumor, it's not necessarily true. I think there were allusions made that China would remember the comments about Hong Kong and make sure that it vetoes whatever the Germans accept. I don't think it's going to play out that way. I don't think it matters, because China has had a policy of following Russia, roughly, in terms of the votes. So you're back to basically the 3 members that matter.
I was interested in kind of the Chinese drones being sold to UAE and used in Libya, that there was a comment recently that China had more outspokenly so than normal commented on, the UAE violating China's end-user certificate by re-exporting to Libya. And I was wondering if there's a shift that you see, or if that's it. So I was curious about that can play a role.
Well, just one thing. The Chinese have, as an argument to sell their hardware, one of the arguments is they don't bother people. Like they don't enforce the license or the restrictions as drastically as the United States. So that's kind of what makes those, in addition to being cheap, they don't bother their buyers. So they can't really get into the business of bothering their buyers all of a sudden. So inherently, this kind of protest is going to be weak. I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all. It could have technical ramifications. I mean, I think China could do things to really slow it down. And one word from a giant like China does matter. But I don't think it could afford to kind of ruin its market by all of a sudden behaving like the United States and like being like worried about human rights and violations. So I tend to discount it.
Any other reflections or any other questions? We're almost running out of time. Celine?
Celine Morgan from Geneva Call. I have a question about the south of Libya. There was a lot of focus now on armed actors in Tripoli, but in the couple of weeks and months before the attack on Tripoli, Haftar's forces took a wide range of the south. I was wondering actually if you could share some insight on how he managed to get allies who can, it seems so, keep this territory until now. Or are they keeping it, or is it starting to get fragmented as well?
Mm-hmm. Let's take another question or two with final, and then address.
Okay, so very quickly, my name is Hafiz, a fellow at GCSB. I have a couple of questions for our speakers. Starts with the community. So for Rebecca, what is the nature of community engagement? As you have said, the civilians are completely disconnected from the government. They want to remove the militias as well, but we know that Libya is very based on sub-identities in those three regions. So what's the nature of community engagement with the militias that are from their own community, because they depend on them for security and justice. For the other part, so the nature of alliances, has it changed with the militias? So what I'm trying to say is that because the militias since 2011 believe that they're protecting the spirit of the revolution, has the nature and the reasons and the factors building towards alliances have changed among militias or not? The last part, you've said that it's going to be there's no future, like it's very bleak for Libya, and there's a continuation. Does that mean it's going to be a low-risk context? Is there a factor that might happen leading to interventionist approach, like what happened with Nato in 2011? Is it going to be on a low-risk context that it's going to continue for several years? The last thing, if any of you could touch on illicit trade and how it has developed in Libya since 2011.
So many questions. Sorry, all of these in less than 3-4 minutes. But any other burning questions? Who won't be able to sleep tonight if Isha doesn't ask questions?
Just in the context, just going back to the Haftar point in France, I heard the conjecture that because Haftar has had his medical treatment in France, they have an idea of his prognosis, his likely life expectancy, and the idea that they envisage a period of time with a strong man and some solution that they might, I don't know, have concocted in some Paris think tank down the road.
Sorry,
any views on that?
Sorry, I didn't ask about
they have concocted some after plan, I don't know, in some
An
Paris
plan.
think tank, I don't know, but that this was...
good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that the fact that it's stupid is very important. They do believe in an after plan. They're completely in denial. They're completely in denial vis-a-vis the autocratic thrust that Haftar has. So they don't think that he's going to try and install his sons, for instance. They really do believe in elections. They think that he's just trying to win the war. The minute he wins, he's going to deliver the country like George Washington to democracy. They believe those things. And I know a few of them that do believe this thing. I mean, in terms of justifying the policy. Yeah.
And on the South, as well as we think of the other question, do you want to take the South?
I could start, and maybe if you want to add, my reading of the South when Haftar first went before then going up to Tripoli abruptly and leaving everyone in surprise and in the lurch in the south, is I feel he did it quite smart, actually. I think Haftar, from my reading, is forged relationships on the ground, or alliances, and let people, in a way, self-govern themselves, but with the help of a lot of money, of course, from the east. And he did a few clumsy moves. He did a smart move, I think, in the town of Ubari, where he brokered an agreement kind of with the Tuareg who were there, who were not necessarily pro-Haftar. But the Tuareg did it so they wouldn't have another outsider coming in to Sharara oil field nearby. So they were both pragmatic and brokered some sort of deal saying, you know, we'll leave each other alone in one respect. I think Haftar was, when we say Haftar, his loose coalition of different groups did a very clumsy move when it came to Murzouk, when it was the Alad Suleiman and I believe the Mergaha went down to Murzouk to into the town and really came in with Zwaya. The Zwaya tribe is it's on the other side of Libya in the southeast. Haftar, for instance, is married to a Zwaya woman. He is quite close to the Zwaya. They brought the Zwaya in with these other tribes into Murzouk. The Zwaya are sworn enemies in a way with the Tebu inhabitants who mostly live there. So it really caused a lot of animosity when there didn't need to be, and ended up triggering fighting in Murzouk. So there was a clumsy way and a smooth way. However, I think that when Haftar abruptly turned to the north for the April 4th attack on Tripoli, he left a lot of people in the lurch, but still alliances are holding, but yes, I think they're slightly dissembling. This is my feeling. Alad Suleiman, I think, really won out. The Alad Suleiman tribe helped with the Mergaha, also did well. The Gaddafi has been a loser, and the Tebu definitely a loser in this. That's my take.
I mean, you know, the Haftar benefited from the fact that the Tripoli government had completely ignored the south for years.
Absolutely.
It had not done anything for the south, and that allowed Haftar to move in relatively easily, except into Mosul, and to switch some people and to move in with a relatively limited contingent of forces. With a lot of people hoping that he would actually provide things. He would make it possible for cash to be available in the south, etc., etc. Thing is, he pulled out very quickly after he moved in. He pulled out after a few weeks, even before the Tripoli offensive, and abandoned the south to its own devices once again. And until now, you haven't really seen groups in the south that came out in loyalty to Haftar switching back again, because they're all watching what's happening in Tripoli. Essentially, everyone's watching to see whoever will prevail in Tripoli, and they'll shift sides accordingly. The alliances in Western Libya, I think, yes, they are of a different nature now than they were in recent years, because in recent years you had alliances, increasingly opportunistic alliances between a relatively limited number of armed groups that were, competing for control in Tripoli or over Greater Tripoli. But now you have an alliance that is forged together by the existential threat that they face. For them, Haftar ruling Libya is an existential threat. They know that if Haftar manages to seize control, they will have to leave Libya and their families too, and so this is an entirely different nature of an alliance. It is, yes, there is distrust among them, and there is bad blood going back to past conflicts, but this common threat that they are facing, is quite a significant factor involved with it.
Great. Well, on that note, we're running out of time. I know the conversation can be continued, and I'd like to thank all the speakers for all the reflections and insights and analysis, and thank you again for being with us here today. And I'd like to thank you all for all the questions. And well, let's hope that the next panel we organize, it can be called Libya's Future Opportunities rather than Challenges and Possibilities. And thank you again for being here. Thank you very much.